Hello, I'm Lois Zamora, and it's my pleasure to be a part of this introductory course for our Latin American Studies minor. Today I'm recording without any students in the room, so I hope that those of you who are watching will yell very loudly when you have a question. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to hear you. But my topic today is the Baroque and the New World Baroque. Of course, we're interested in what happens when the European Baroque moves across the Atlantic to hit Hispanic and Lusitanian or Portuguese colonies in the New World, and actually France in Canada, which I'm not, the French-Canadian colonies, but I'm not going to be talking about those today. But before we can understand the New World Baroque and that great style, which we might say is the Latin American style, I'm interested in knowing and talking to you about what is the European Baroque. Obviously, the Baroque starts in Europe and goes to Latin America. So first, let's talk a little bit about art historical periods. And here, if I could have my tablet, I would be very interested in showing you a kind of schema. Those of you who have studied art history will certainly know these topics or categories. They're very artificial. It's what is used by art historians to talk about the past in easy and rather shorthand terms. But obviously the 1400s, especially in Italy, is called the Renaissance of classical learning, the rebirth of the taste for and knowledge of classical culture, Greece and Rome. In Italian, it's called the Quattrocento, and you see there I've written it rather scribblily on the right-hand side of your screen. So the 1400s, that's Leonardo da Vinci, that's Fra Angelico. If we had more time, we'd be looking at some of the great artists of the 14th century Renaissance, because we'll eventually be comparing the Baroque and contrasting the Baroque to the Renaissance, to classicism. The 1500s is a kind of in-between century. The Renaissance continues. Michelangelo lives until the middle of the 1500s. He lives to be 90-some. The Sistine Chapel and so forth is in the middle of the 1500s. So it's a high Renaissance. And then I put that word mannerism over on the right hand, or mannerist on the right-hand side, because that is often used as an art historical term to talk about the end of the 1500s. The 1600s are us. It's the Baroque period. It's what we're going to be talking about. Obviously, what we call that is the 17th century. I put those on the right-hand side. All of this is very, very rudimentary, but sometimes we get a little confused because we call the 1600s the 17th century in our way of accounting for the past. In Italian, it's easier. It's the 600s, they call it, the Seicento, as the 1500s are the 500s, the Cinquecento. And then 1700s are the neoclassical period. That's going to be the birth of the U.S. Think of the style, the national style of the U.S. Think of the Capitol. Think of the White House. The monuments in Washington are all neoclassical. They are not Baroque. The U.S. is born, in a sense, after the Baroque. At least the nation is born after the Baroque. Whereas in Latin America, the Baroque is principal. The 1800s, it depends on what country you're talking about, and the 1900s, obviously the century we've just finished, we're less concerned about, except that I want to say that we're not only talking about the Baroque period in the 17th century here. What we're going to be talking about is, and I'll talk to you again later in the semester, is about the rebirth of the Baroque in the 20th century. The Baroque is a very ornate style. We're going to see lots of examples in a minute. I'm going to be showing you pictures more than anything today, art and architecture, because the Baroque is first and foremost an art historical category. It is also literary. There's Baroque literature, and we can speak of the Baroque period in terms of historical periods, but the defining medium is art and architecture. So we're going to be looking at that. You'll see when we see it that there's a great deal of dynamism, of verve, of distortion, of movement, of drama, of theatricality in the Baroque. Whereas if you think again of the Capitol in the U.S., the White House, the Washington and Lincoln memorials, not the Washington, the Jefferson and Lincoln memorials, you'll see quite the opposite feel. It's staid, it's quadricular, it's quiet. So think of a contrasting style in order better to think about the Baroque, and we'll talk more about those contrasts, what the Baroque brings to the neoclassical, rather to the High Renaissance, and then how it differs from the neoclassical. But I'm wandering from my point. My point is what happens to the Baroque in the 20th century. It gets recovered, it gets remembered, it gets revised and recuperated for new cultural purposes. After the Baroque period, and it lasts longer in Latin America through 1750, it lasts into what we call the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, the neoclassical period. It lasts into that century when Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and the philosophes in France are celebrating reason and clarity and neoclassical styles. The Baroque in Latin America is still flourishing. But then after a while, European tastes and European preferences take over, and there is a real hatred for the Baroque. Baroque churches are sacked, they're ruined. Lots of times in Mexico City, you'll have a Baroque exterior and a neoclassical interior. And the richer the church, the more likely it would be to happen that the Baroque retablos, or altarpieces, would get thrown on a bonfire, and we would make way for the neoclassical. Fortunately, a great deal of the Baroque in Latin America has survived this period of, let's say, depreciation, of disgrace of the Baroque. This stands for the old ways, it stands for the Counter-Reformation, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. It stands for the Inquisition, it stands for colonial, monarchical Catholic oppression, because it's the colonizing style. But then in the 20th century, something interesting happens, and we'll talk about this next time I talk to you when we're talking about literature in the 20th century. But I want you to see that the Baroque, and what we might call the Neo-Baroque, or the second time around Baroque, in the 20th century involves an understanding that the New World Baroque isn't just a model of European Catholicism, imperialism, monarchical style. It's really lo nuestro, it's ours, as Lezama Lima and Alejo Carpentier like to say. They talk in the 1940s and the 1950s, they say, you know what? The Baroque isn't just the art of the conquest, of the conquista, it's also an art of contra-conquista, an art of counter-conquest. Why? Because when the Baroque gets to American soil, indigenous styles, indigenous labor, American materials, African influence take over. And so when you compare the European Baroque and the New World Baroque, what you have is a deeply New World form of expression. This gets said along about the 1920s and 1930s, really by the 1950s for the first time. Until then, and even with cultural historians up into the 1980s, the Baroque is still just barely worthy of attention because it's the bad style. It's the style that accompanied the conquerors on their ships to the New World. So it's a very interesting, let's say, re-evaluation, re-vindication of the Baroque in the 20th century. And so you get an author like Garcia Marquez, whom you're going to be reading, I trust, and wonderfully so, who will say, oh, I'm not a magical realist, I don't know about that term. What I am is a Baroque writer. I go back to Cervantes, I go back to the great epic tradition of the Baroque. So the reason that I'm interested, frankly, in the Baroque, besides the fact that I happen to love the way it looks, is that my field is contemporary Latin American fiction, and I'm interested to see the continuities between the colonial regime, the Baroque, as it's implanted in the New World, and then what happens to it over centuries when it comes back up for air in the middle of the 20th century and is continuing to do so. So the Baroque and the Neo-Baroque are going to be, over the course of the semester, our concern, at least when I talk to you. So we now have our art historical categories. What we're going to be doing is mainly talking about the 17th century today and into the 18th century. I've got the European art historical categories on the tablet that I showed you. I said 17th century. Art historians mainly agree that the New World Baroque is later and longer. They tend to say that it starts around 1640. It takes a while for it to filter over to the New World, and then, as I said already, it continues into the middle of the 18th century. The high Baroque in Mexico, called Churrigueresque or Churrigueresco, after two brothers, architects from Spain, called Churriguera. That Churrigueresco style is really in the middle of the 1700s. So it goes on until, let's say, 1750, 1760. So when I say to you Baroque period, you're going to say in Europe it's 17th century, that's the 1600s, and in Latin America it's later and longer, 1640s more or less to the 1750s or 60s. So we have our time frame very clearly. Now, we have to do one more historical and date business before we can go ahead and look at some wonderful art. And that is, we have to think about why the Baroque, why this radical change in style, because you will see that it's quite a change from the earlier, more quiet, classical style of the Renaissance. And what was happening in the 17th century, and indeed in the 16th. And I'm going to see if I can turn my page here. Turned it the wrong way. There it is. Just a couple of words, Reformation and Counter-Reformation, on our tablet. Notice that these are the 1500s, these dates. You have to have them. So this, we're talking about what happens in the 16th century that's going to create the need for a Baroque style. Martin Luther, as you know, pounds his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517. Now, keep balancing Europe against the New World. What's going on in 1517 in America? Well, we have 1492, of course, but it's going to be 4 years later that Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, is taken by Hernán Cortés. So that the moment that you have this really serious unrest in Europe, and especially in Northern Europe, you're having the establishment of the monarchy, the Spanish Catholic monarchy in the New World. So what you have is, on one hand, the expansion into the New World of the Catholic domain, let's say, or the expansion of the Catholic domain into the New World, I should say. And on the other hand, you have this whole group of Protestants getting really upset with the Catholic Church. Between 1517, and by the way, Luther never intended to establish a new church. He wanted reforms within his church, the Catholic Church, but as things got more and more out of control, there were separations of groups. As you know, we can't go into too much into the 16th century here. But look at what happens. We have this term Counter-Reformation. Catholic scholars don't call it the Counter-Reformation, they call it the Catholic Reform. So we have the Protestant reform, or the protest, if you want, that is the reform in the North against abuses of Catholic practice, as you know. And then we have the Catholic reform. The Catholic Church loses 1/3 of its believers between 1517 and 1545, when Pope Paul III calls an ecumenical council. He calls every Catholic leader that he can find, which is to say all of them, and they meet in the town of Trent in Germany. And they say, this is serious, people. We've lost 1/3 of our believers. There's iconoclasm in the North because the Protestants were never very in favor of the beauty that Catholic churches feel will conduct the believer to the divine. The Protestant says, no, this is an obstruction to prayer. We got to have our bare walls, and so there's a real difference in attitude about the use of images in worship on the Protestant side and the Catholic side. But the Council of Trent really does need to be remembered if you're interested in the Baroque, because during these almost 20 years, there were 3 different sessions, each one about 18 to 20 months, where the cardinals and Catholic hierarchy met together and said, what are we going to do? If you go to the web and you put in Council of Trent, you will find the 25 decrees that were issued from the Council of Trent about, well, for example, church positions, bishoprics, should not be handed out to people who don't live in that area. We really need to have bishops living where they're supposed to be working. Things like that. We've got to clean up our administrative practices. For us who are interested in the Baroque, the most important is the last of the 25 decrees, the 25th decree, that speaks about the use of art in Catholic practice. It stated very clearly that images are not to be worshipped. That would be idolatry, but they are to be used to inspire belief. They're to be used to allow the believer to think about the most sacred of moments, the passion and death of Jesus Christ. So there are also discussions of how loud the sermon should be and the music, whether there should be incense used. All of this interest in the training of believers and the inspiration of believers and the conversion of new believers, that's where the New World comes in, through the senses. The Baroque is always sensory. We should feel the pain of the martyrs dying. You'll see quite a lot of blood in a minute. We should sense the importance of suffering, the great sacrifice, let's say, of Jesus on the cross. I could name a lot of other things we should feel. I use that as the principal example of the sanctity of suffering, which is going to be important for the Baroque. But the point is that this was going to be an opulent art. The Council of Trent gave the green light in 1563 to a huge patronage of art and architecture that comes along by the 17th century in the Baroque. So popes begin to say, look, Rome is going to be the most beautiful city that ever was. Those fellows up in the north, they can protest all they want, but we have money and we believe in beauty. We believe that beauty is part of what needs to be fomented, supported by the church, because that's part of God's world. So there's a whole theory and a theology of art and what art's role should be in conversion, in saving those people who might have left the church otherwise. So for all of those theological reasons, we get a huge flowering of color, of movement, of emotion. We're to look at a suffering saint and be moved to believe. So all of this emotion is really a result of the Ecumenical Council of Trent, where the role of art in worship is established. So I think if we remember those for now, there are many other dates. Let me just write here down here, 1521, America. That's the conquest, or if you want, the defeat of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. So let me put Mexico City here. Slightly later, I believe 1531, Peru. So as this religious foment, the first time in 1500 years that there was really a question of which should I choose? What should I do? A searching of conscience about how should I believe? You see, it's a huge, if we don't understand the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, we won't understand the Baroque, as I've already said. We can't go into that anymore. But think of what's going on, by the way. We're North Americans. Let's think, at least some of us are, let's think about what's going on in North America in 1521. Nothing is going on. It takes almost 100 years, 1620, for the Pilgrims to land at Plymouth Rock. The English imperial project was not about conversion. It was not interested in indigenous populations. So the area that the Spaniards, Catholics, were interested in were the highly populated areas. Also, of course, because that meant there was lots of labor. They also looked to mountainous areas where there happened to be silver that could be mined and so forth. But for now, let's just, as we're trying to locate that Baroque period, let's think about other dates and so forth. So here we have the Pilgrims. As you know, it's the 400th anniversary of Jamestown, so I guess I could put 1607 here. There was something last night on PBS about that. So, but it's much later that the English settlements really begin to take hold. So, as I said, the United States as a nation, and even North America as a community, as a people, let's say, get started late for the Baroque, because the Pilgrims, of course, what are they? They're Protestants. They're even more reformed than the reformers. That's why they go to North America in the first place. They have no truck with anything Catholic. They have no truck with anything Jesuitical. The Jesuits were the great purveyors of the Baroque in the New World. So the Pilgrims, if you couldn't imagine their churches, and we sort of can, we have some early colonial churches, bare walls, white, no visual images. Martin Luther says visual images would be interesting, you know, if they're accompanied by text, but we don't want them hanging up there on walls. That might lead to idiosyncratic interpretation. We are going to be a text-based, print-based culture. Everybody's going to read the Bible. We don't need those pictures to tell the biblical stories, because literacy will be a major issue in Protestant communities. So there's a very different attitude on the part of Protestants and Catholics, on the part of the English imperial project and the Spanish imperial project, in putting up pictures. And that's what we're interested in, is the pictures. So let's, for the moment, go and to some of my slides and see what we can see. I think we have to start with the European Baroque for a moment. I wish we could do more of this, but let's do as much as we can. I'm just going to show you a few monuments of 17th century European Baroque. Let me start here by having a little slideshow on my iPhoto program. It likes to change every minute, so I have to come back and forth. But here you have, if you had to choose one work of European Baroque art as typical, as epitomizing the Baroque, you might choose this one. It's a statue, as you can see, of marble by Bernini. Look at the dates, right smack dab in the middle of the 17th century. This is in a church in Rome, the Coronaro Chapel, and I should show you more slides because it's not just this statue. There are others in this chapel, but this is the essential one. This is actually, I should title it what's more often called, which is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Saint Teresa of Avila, who founded the Reformed Order of the Carmelites in the late 1500s. Her order was very important in proselytizing. She was made a saint in 1622, so she's one of our Baroque saints. The Baroque saints mainly are like her. They started the Reformed orders. I'm going to go back now. We're going to have to keep doing this because I can't get it to stay for more than a minute, and I have more to say about it than a minute's worth. But what this is Saint Teresa in ecstasy. What does that mean? She is united with God. She says in her writings that she felt moments when she was united with God. So she's in a trance, if you want. This is a mystic, Saint Teresa. And what is that angel with his little smile doing? It's not a Cupid, don't make that mistake, please. It's an angel with an arrow, because she says in her memoir, her life, it's called Las Mordadas, that she felt the word of God piercing her heart. So we have her here. Look at, she's on clouds. She's up in heaven in her ecstasy. I think I have a close-up of her head. No, I don't in this. I'm going to suggest you a great book for learning more about the European Baroque if you want to do that, because we don't have time. But her eyes are rolled back. You'll see lots of swooning saints. You'll see martyred saints and swooning saints in the Baroque. Why? Because we needed both if we were Catholics wishing to reconquer Europe and to conquer the New World. We needed martyrs, people who were willing to go out and risk their lives and die happily for a cause. Don't think that martyrdom is limited to only a few religions. It's certainly a very basic part of Christianity, and in this period in particular. And also the ecstatic part, the sense that the human self could relate to and become indeed one with God. Now, if you look at this image, what you'll see is an interesting tension that's very characteristic of the Baroque. Two different things are true at once. In this case, eroticism and otherworldliness, or if you want, sensuousness and spirituality. The flesh, the body, the feelings can take you to God, can unite you with God. So that seems a contradiction in terms, spirituality and sensuality at the same time. We're going to see it all the time. What I call it, and indeed John Rupert Martin in the book I'm going to recommend to you also calls it, is transcendental naturalism. You have the most realistic face and hands and feet of Saint Teresa, even as what we're really being told in this statue is you too can lose your body and become one with Christ. So even that most realistic flesh and blood realism, as I call it, here there's not a lot of blood, but certainly some flesh, leads us to get rid of the body, in a sense, leads us to another level of spirituality. So, okay, now changing radically, I'm just going to show you sort of the top 10 of European Baroque. This is Diego Velázquez. If Bernini is the great Roman Baroque artist. He was an architecture as well as a sculptor. Velázquez is the great Spanish Baroque painter. This is one of the most famous paintings on earth, I think. It's there on the left. You'll see Velázquez painting a big old canvas. We see the back of the canvas. And for a moment, we assume he's painting the Infanta Margarita. That would be the daughter of Philip IV, who was the patron of Velázquez. Velázquez was a court painter, and here he proudly paints himself with the cross of St. James on his tunic, but we see in his right hand his paintbrush and so forth. But if we think a little more, and we are careful to look, we say, now, is he really? He's not looking. Excuse me, that's one more Velázquez we're going to see. He's not looking at the Infanta Margarita, he's looking at me. He's looking at the viewer standing in front of the painting. But what else might he be looking at? Look at the reflection in the mirror at the back of the room. It turns out, we can recognize them because we've seen them in lots of others of Velázquez's paintings. It's the king and queen, Philip IV and his queen. He's painting the king and queen who stand where I'm standing as a viewer outside of the canvas. This is typical of the Baroque, this play of reflections. We get a painter painting himself painting. There's often a play with levels of reality. We also get a painter painting something that we only see reflected in the mirror at the back of the room. So the reflection of the subject of the painting. The painting isn't about what it's painting at all. It's about, some art historians say, it's about Velázquez trying to make himself important. Once more, we're not quite done yet here with Las Meninas. By the way, Las Meninas means ladies in waiting. Another reason why we might think he's painting this group that stands in front of us. Those are the Infanta Margaritas, ladies in waiting. You see on the second from the right is a dwarf who would have been a playmate of the Infanta, and a little kid on the very right. Look at, he's putting his foot on the dog there. They're just kind of having a nice little afternoon. This group around the Infanta, who's terribly beautifully dressed. Velázquez did a portrait of her in that very dress, a full-size portrait, so we know who she is and what she looks like. Behind the Menina, in the middle, we see a nun and a priest or a brother, a friar. So everything here is represented. But what my point is in showing this painting is, first, if you wanted to say what is another epitome of Baroque art, you would say Las Meninas, for the reasons I've stated. I show you one more of Velázquez's huge obra, his huge group of works, and I hope you'll have or will see some in the flesh, as it were, on canvas rather than in books. There are plenty of them, and they're often Velázquez shows, but the Prado in Madrid is the great repository of Velázquez. Here, Venus at her toilette, preparing, let's say, dressing. Here you do have a Cupid. This is Cupid and Venus. When you have a Venus, you'll often have a little winged creature who's her messenger fellow. And she's looking at herself in a mirror. One more time, this idea of reflection. We don't see her, but we see her reflection. Art historians like to say that it's distorted. Her face wouldn't reflect in that way because it's too far to the right. But this is very Baroque. Look at the curtains, the folds in the drapery. You're often going to see in Baroque painting that kind of, this is a very different kind of drapery. Let me just go back one more minute. The curtain. Why a curtain there? Well, to take up space. Well, to show the virtuosity of the painter. It's hard to get those folds and those reflections. Look at the way the color is manipulated, how we get a little line of white showing the fold as it comes out toward us and so forth. So it's a compositional and a technical matter. It's also, I think, typical of the Baroque because the Baroque likes folds. It likes sinuosity. It likes the ups and downs and overs. It resists a straight line, the opposite of the neoclassical. Again, think of the Parthenon, think of the US Capitol. So the fold will become an important motif, as will columns in but columns of decorative sort, not straight. They're going to have garlands. They're going to be all twisty. Again, a reaction against the sobriety of the Renaissance. And here, Peter Paul Rubens from the north. He's Catholic. He was born in Germany, but settled in Antwerp, now in Belgium. It was the southern Netherlands, property of Spain until the late 1500s, but the reason Belgium is Catholic to this day and Holland is Protestant is because there was a war in the north. Spain lost the southern part of its possessions, called the Netherlands at that time, and so we consider the Netherlands to be Holland. But Rubens, a great Catholic artist, and again, one of the top five. We've just seen Bernini, we've seen Velázquez, now we have Rubens. And would you excuse me, it's R-U-B-E-N-S. That is a terrible mistake at the top of your screen. Rubens, R-U-B-E-N-S, the Descent from the Cross. You see the realism, now we're going to start seeing Christ's, I'm sorry about this. Look at the fellow in the upper right. It's called the Descent of the Cross. Look at the fellow in the upper right. He's holding the shroud with his teeth. What an odd pictorial detail. Rubens wants to show us that this is a heavy body. This is a human body. This isn't just a God that's disembodied. The body is important here. It's heavy. Look at the work that people are going to get him down off the cross. He also, this is part of a triptych, the middle panel. It now is in the cathedral in Antwerp. I highly recommend it to you. The other great triptych that is in the cathedral in Antwerp is the Elevation of the Cross. I don't believe we're going to see that today. We have to get on to our New World Baroque. So the cast of characters, you have Mary, the suffering mother here, Mary Magdalene, always shown at the foot of the cross, and another less identified Mary, but three women. You have the Apostle John, you have Saint Joseph of Arimathea, who gave the tomb. Remember, there was no tomb ready for Christ, and so it's an identifiable cast of characters. Now let's go on to our next, and hope that that thing goes away. This is Caravaggio, number 4 of the great Baroque painters. Italian and early. Everyone knew what Caravaggio was doing. Caravaggio took chiaro oscuro, that light that comes in from an outside source, to new levels. Here you have another descent or entombment of Christ. Again, the three Marys, Mary Magdalene with her hands raised, the ecstatic Mary the mother with her shroud, and the other Mary there. Caravaggio does a self-portrait. He puts himself in as this man in the foreground. That's Caravaggio's face. He wants to play a role in this painting, it would seem. Okay, let's go on. I wish that would go away, but it won't. You'll just ignore that line at the bottom. A detail, the suffering mother. Let's go back and see where she is on the painting. Here you find her. I pointed to her already. Look at the way the light is handled. You can barely see this guy. The light comes in from the left-hand side. It shines. Look at the very strong shadows. Light and shadow is absolutely typical. The use, the manipulation of the illusion of space with light is essential. And of course, the light shines on this very human body of Christ. The emphasis on the suffering body of the man, not the etherealized Christ of the resurrection. For that reason, Good Friday in Latin America is much more important than Easter Sunday. There you see the lines. She could be your aunt, she could be your mother. She's utterly realistically deployed and depicted, but why? For what purpose? So that we can understand the metaphysical, the spiritual, so that the realism as a way of understanding the super real, the spiritual. And then one more by Caravaggio. This is Mary Magdalene. I have a particular interest in Mary Magdalene. And she was kind of a poster girl for the Baroque. In part, that's why I'm interested in her. Why was she a poster girl? Because she was a convert. The Baroque art and artists were interested, and the church was interested in converts. What were they doing? Converting the entire Americas at this period in the 1600s. She was also a penitent. She converted from a life of easy luxury. Remember, she was a courtesan, a prostitute, if you want. She was an elegant prostitute, but many paintings, and I'll show you a couple more, show her putting away her worldly things to follow Christ. That was a message that the church wanted to get out. Why is she asleep here? Why is she looking so calm? Because she's been forgiven. She's done penance for her sins, for her former life. Why is penance so important at this period? Remember, the Protestants are throwing penance as a sacrament out the window. Protestants do not go to confession. Martin Luther says, if you're baptized and you believe, you'll be forgiven. So it's pushing, I'm showing you, that's the detail down at the bottom. I'm going to show you in a minute. But first I wish I could get rid of this. I can't. Anyway, I'm going to show you a detail in the lower left that you can't see very well because my icons are up. But penance became very, very important. So we're going to see a penitent Magdalene quite often in Baroque painting. How do we know this is Mary Magdalene? We know it by her attributes. What are attributes? They're the visual language, the visual syntax of Baroque art. People at the time could read it like we read a book. Look at that 1/2 second, say, oh, Mary Magdalene. How do they know? Because of the broken pearls and the vessel with oil. Mary Magdalene, or an unnamed woman, in fact, in the Bible, washes Christ's feet with her tears and dries them with her hair. This vessel is to remind us of that washing, the ablution of Christ's feet, and the broken pearls are to remind us of her former life of luxury, now in pieces. Why pearls? Well, the broken pearls look a little like tears, do they not? And also, think of the symbolic value of pearls. Pearls are a bit of dirt, a bit of grit that gets into an oyster or a gastropod of other sorts and becomes something beautiful. So something, let's say, ugly becomes something beautiful. Ah, what a wonderful idea for representing conversion. Your soul is a little sullied, and then it becomes beautiful when you convert. So pearls become a symbol of Mary Magdalene, as does this vessel. We'll see some more. Look at those two earrings, will you? We're not into jewelry too much here, but let's look at them. They are Baroque pearls. To this day, if you buy an irregular pearl, it is called a Baroque pearl. Baroque, one of the etymologies of the word comes from the word wart in Latin, verruga in Spanish. It means something lumpy, bumpy, not regular. This is a great metaphor for the Baroque. Haven't I said it already? The Baroque likes the extravagant, it likes the extreme, it likes the asymmetrical, unlike the Renaissance classicism that it was following. So those are Baroque prose. There are other etymologies, and indeed the Baroque etymology is dismissed by people, but I'm going to go ahead with my pictures because we're getting behind. Another Caravaggio, he certainly didn't only do religious painting. By the way, Caravaggio is known just like that, Caravaggio. His name is actually Michelangelo de Medici, but he's from the town of Caravaggio, and that's how he's known. He had a dissolute life, died young, a very, very great genius. He did, as did all of the Baroque and European Baroque, and also New World, but less New World. New World Baroque is hugely religious because of the work of conversion that art was supposed to do. But nonetheless, here you see, I wanted to show you a Narcissus, a beautiful young man looking at his reflection in the water. I show it, and it's a big, again, a big myth. I won't say poster myth, but a myth that's important to the Baroque because of this whole problem of seeing, this problem of appearance is what we're seeing real. The idea that the world is no longer so solid or so easily known. This in the Cathedral of Seville, one of the great Baroque crucifixes in the European mode, not a great deal of blood. It hangs, as I said, in the Cathedral of Seville. If you read John Rupert Martin's book, which I'm going to hold up for you in a minute, you'll see that there's a great argument here about the way that the head is tilted, the eyes are open in order for the believer to look and see Christ. One more example, the ceiling, painted ceiling of the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome. As you know, St. Ignatius is the founder of the Jesuits. The Jesuits are the great promoters of Baroque art. If you see a Jesuit church, at least in New Spain, it's going to be elaborate. And certainly in Rome, it's going to be very heavily decorated, ornate, many, many, many images. This is a trompe-l'œil. We use the French term that means to deceive the eye. This isn't quite a flat ceiling, but it certainly isn't open to the sky. The Baroque loves the trick that makes you think that something is bigger than it is, that it's farther away. So you get all of these heavenly hosts flying around. I'm going to show you a detail. It's the apotheosis of St. Ignatius. Up there in the very middle here is a little St. Ignatius floating up to heaven with the help of an angel. But you see people here falling and flying. This is very typical of the Roman Baroque, this trompe-l'œil structure. We've all seen it. If you go downtown into Houston, there'll be a blank side of a building that'll have doors and windows, and suddenly you say, I didn't realize they'd built a new building there, and then you'll realize it's painted. It's so real, so realistically painted that you mistake it for real rather than a painting. That's what the Baroque liked. Okay, so that a teeny beeny weeny, we didn't see any Rembrandt, we didn't see any Vermeer, we didn't see very much Caravaggio. We should have seen more. We should have looked at more Bernini. So if you want to pursue the European Baroque, and I think you have to if you're interested in the New World, I strongly recommend this book. It's John Rupert Martin's book called, as I say, in un-Baroque fashion, it's called simply Baroque. It should have a longer title somehow. But you see, this is not St. Teresa. This is another of Bernini's swooning saints in marble, also in Rome. St. Ludovica, she's in another church. But in any case, Martin's book is 1977. It remains a kind of classic in looking at how the European Baroque communicates and why, what it needs to communicate. And it's not just about the religious warfare that I've been talking about. It's about the incredible scientific discoveries of the 17th century. Remember, Galileo is under house arrest in about 1620 or so. You can help me with the dates there. But early Baroque period, the church is still resisting scientific discovery. People are still worried. Pascal, the great French philosopher of doubt, is saying, oh my goodness, now here we are, we poor humans caught between infinity and the infinitesimal. Space, the microscope, the telescope is coming up. The whole heavens are no longer a comfy cover for the human soul, but indeed a perspective on the infinite. So the Baroque is responding not only to ecclesiastical and theological imperatives, but also to the increase in learning. It's really the beginning of modernity for me, because the circulation of the blood. Think of Rembrandt's painting The Anatomy a Lesson, where he shows a bunch of Amsterdam burghers watching a body be skinned and interested in the muscles. So there's a huge revolution in the way in learning, as well as a revolution in the way that people thought about belief and where they located their beliefs. Added to these revolutions is the revolution of the New World. Imagine, the map seemed fairly defined. And then suddenly, and this is of course 1492, though Columbus died swearing he had discovered nothing new because it was not on the Catholic maps of the world. It took Amerigo Vespucci, as you know, in 1507, I believe, sailing down the coast further south than Columbus went, to say, no, this is not Cathay, this is something bigger. We've got to rethink the maps of the world. But by the 1500s, the news is coming back from the New World. The globe itself seems to have expanded to the point of explosion. So what you had in science, in theology, in geology, in astronomy that seems certain over the course of the 15th and then more in the 16th century begins to look exceedingly uncertain. So we use our art to nail things down. It's a conservative art, the Baroque, as a Catholic matter in the 17th century. But now what we want to do is go and see what happens to this conservative Catholic monarchical hierarchical art and beautiful art when it gets to the New World. So let me just change here for one moment my program, and we're going to go to a website that I have for the classes I teach. You'll see that now on your screen, and if you're interested in these different picture galleries, you can take your pick. Some of them are designed for my courses in magical realism and some for my courses on the New World Baroque, but I think some of these galleries would be interesting to you. I'm going to start with the one, and I'm just going to talk about the art, and I hope that that'll be a way of instructing you as you look at these pictures about what the Baroque is, rather than defining it from A to Z. I think we'll end up with a definition as we work through these. The next, and you'll see that, by the way, on my site, not to advertise my website, I don't mean to do that, you have enough reading as it is, but we will get to 100 Years of Solitude, and you'll see that down here I put up 3 illustrated lectures, what I call illustrated lectures, and the middle one, Monsters and Martyrs, is about Garcia Marquez and Baroque art. And so you might want to think about taking a look at that. You'll see my argument, and you'll see the pictures that I use to say that Garcia Marquez's characters have a lot to do with Baroque painting, and his narrative structure has to do with certain kinds of expressive forms in the Baroque. So I just recommend that to your attention. I'm going to start actually and look at some of the Baroque art that I do use with Garcia Marquez. And so let's start with this. This is almost all New World. And some of it is going to look pretty European to you because it was an academic art. We're going to end up with the folk Baroque, where we're going to see a lot more of the hand of the indigenous artist. And we're going to see more the rural, the informal, the incorrect, let's say, art of, by incorrect I mean not doctrinal. I mean it's not like that ceiling in Rome that we looked at where everything is according to Hoyle, according to the Catholic Church. I mean St. Ignatius Church isn't going to have any funny business with respect to belief. But here, let me just show you levitating figures. These are 4 paintings by Jose Ibarra. Levitation, flying. If you've read Garcia Marquez's The Old Man with Enormous Wings, you might have a thought or two about that. I talk about it in my essay. But here we have, as I list them on top, ascension, here's the ascension of Christ, the suffering mother here looking up, he's coming out of the tomb, the apostles around, and so forth. That's the ascension. Here Pentecost, the speaking in tongues, again the apostles listening, Mary, the Virgin, super important in Latin American art. Here are the Assumption of the Virgin, God, the Trinity up here, God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, and the Virgin of the Apocalypse. Now, the Virgin of the Apocalypse is very important because Saint Michael plays a role here. Saint Michael is slaying a dragon that is attacking a woman clothed in sun. This is from the book of Revelation, and God is helping out up here. Notice the way this is. You might think it's the same painting as the one I'm going to show you next, but it's not. It's that these paintings become very conventional. There's a certain way of doing this figure described in the book of Revelation as a woman clothed in sun. She's not described as the Virgin Mary, but she's often taken as and for the Virgin Mary. But the Virgin Mary doesn't have wings. So you can see that this is a particular scene being illustrated. This art illustrates biblical text. So here, look at Saint Michael, who kills the dragon. His attribute is a sword. Here, it's another painting. Can we see it? Okay, I hope you can. I'm supposed to look down here. Well, it's not the very best of reproductions, but you get a bit the idea. Again, Saint Michael. It's a different composition. You see the God, he is up here putting the angels, as it's described in the book of Revelation, giving angels to this woman clothed in sun, who also represents the church, according to certain, the nascent church, according to certain biblical commentators. It's a different details, but basically, if you didn't look closely, you could think it's the same painting. What is this to tell us? It's to tell us that by the middle of the 1700s, that's the 18th century, Miguel Cabrera, the very greatest of Mexican Baroque painters, is very schooled in how you do it. This is not about the artist's originality. This isn't, oh, I think I'm inspired today to represent this scene in the Bible in a certain way. No, you have to read the Bible. You have to be very careful that you're doctrinally correct as you represent these scenes. So here, the Virgin of the Apocalypse. I wish my computer were a little lighter, but I don't dare play with it now. Another Virgin of the Apocalypse. Here you see the same. She doesn't have the baby this time, but we have the Saint Michael here by Cristobal Villalpando. There's a gallery on my website that I just showed you, dedicated altogether to his work. Villalpando and Cabrera are the great new Spanish Baroque painters, and so we see a lot of them. Here you get a different feel altogether. Saint Michael is hacking away at these dragons, which has 7 heads, for the 7 emperors of Rome that persecuted the Christians. Remember, the book of Revelation is written about 100 years after Christ, 93 or something AD. And what we have here is a bunch of water. Now, what's this water, all these drops? Well, it's about the fact that the dragon, in a last-ditch attempt to get this woman clothed in sun under his control, has spewed out a bunch of water. If you read that passage, you'll know that. The people who saw this painting would have known that. They would have said, oh, isn't that an interesting way to handle the water in that scene? I do believe they would, I do believe they would have recognized, instead of saying, what is that odd use of water in that scene? So these things are known. This is one of my favorite paintings, again, by an early Mexican Baroque painter, the mystical marriage of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. How do we know that it's Saint Catherine of Alexandria? Down here, if we could see it better, we would see a broken wheel. It would have a spoke. It does have a spike, rather, coming out of it. She's holding a palm. These are all hints. Plus, we know that St. Catherine had a vision of the mystical marriage, her mystical marriage with the infant Christ. He's putting a ring on her finger. The Catherine wheel, she was tortured. She was an early saint. She was tortured, but on a wheel, a tortured rack, where she was to be pulled apart. You notice she's perfectly fine. Martyrs are always painted quite whole. And Saint Lucy, whose eyes were taken out, is shown with a platter, great Surbarán series of women saints, with a platter with her eyes on it, but also her eyes in her head. martyrs are protected. So we feel terrible about them. At the same time, we celebrate their victory over their enemies. It's a very militant church, the Baroque, and the Baroque art represents this militant Catholic Church at this time. The palm, if you see it, you will always know it's a saint who died a martyr's death. So the palm is the attribute of martyrdom. In this case, the Catherine wheel is the attribute of Saint Catherine. And it's always exploded because she triumphs over her torturers in this way. The Virgin Mary is seated on a cloud. Her feet never touch the earth. It looks a bit like a rock, but it is a cloud. And then one of my favorite parts of all of New World Baroque painting, this flutter of wings, this bevy of angels up here. Again, there's always this break. It's in fact literally called rompimiento in Spanish art history, this break into the infinity of this transcendental world, even as we see how realistically portrayed these human beings are. I love this painting. I like to use it with my magical realism course because it's the magic and the real, right, or the supernatural and the sensible worlds in the same painting, separated by this diagonal line. Look at the complexity of the brocade, the folds that we are come to know and love in the Baroque. The maidservant, it seems, of Saint Catherine here, looking on with a very realistic worry on her face. What is this, she says. So we get the real here and the magical here, if you want, although you might not like that word magical, you might prefer miraculous. But the Baroque will always posit, as does magical realism in the 20th century, the possibility that both things can exist at once, that there doesn't need to be an either-or. Same with life and death, same with eroticism and otherworldliness. I can go through a whole list of opposites that I like to say about the Baroque as I say about magical realism, which I think is a 20th century flowering of the Baroque magical realism. It's not something that just happened all of a sudden in Latin America, as we can see from these 17th and 18th century paintings. It's not an either-or structure, it's an both-and. We can have both life and death, we can have ghosts in the room, we can have spirits in the room, we can have God in the room, if you want, at the same time that things are portrayed exceedingly realistically. Another by Luis Juarez. Luis Juarez is a very great painter. I recommend him to your attention. His dates, look at them. Oops, they were back there. They're earlier. It's the earlier part. So I've shown you Villalpando and Cabrera, who come in the middle of the 18th century. And now we're showing Luis Juarez, who comes in the second, third, fourth decades of the 1600s, so 100 years and more earlier. Again, this magical real, or if you want, Baroque separation between them and us, between the heavenly creatures and the saint who's having, you always know San Ildefonso because this is always how he's shown. It is in legend that the Virgin Mary puts on his chasuble, that piece of ecclesiastical garment that he's receiving from Mary. Again, she stands on a cloud that looks like a rock. Again, she's accompanied with all sorts of heavenly creatures. It's a very funny composition. This wing here of this angel looks like it's coming out the other side of the Virgin's head. These little fellows don't have their proportions quite right. It's part of that incorrectness of the New World Baroque. If you looked at this painting, you might say European, but if you know a little bit about the New World Baroque, you're going to say, no, that looks to me like Mexico. That's what you're going to say. Let's keep going fairly quickly. Another by Juarez. There are his dates, 1620 to 1667. Again, I choose this is St. Augustine and the angel because of this commerce between our world and another world. It's perfect. Oh, there is no look of surprise. There the angel with his little finger either pointing to a passage or suggesting a reading to St. Augustine, the great, one of the four doctores de la Iglesia, one of the four celebrated intellectuals of the church, 4th century, as you know. and another by Luis Juarez, this Saint Michael. This is the same scene as the Virgin of the Apocalypse without the Virgin, without the winged woman handing the baby up to God. This is Saint Michael killing that dragon that attacks the Virgin or the woman clothed in sun in the book of Revelation. It's just here treated very differently. Now we don't have a kind of worm-like figure with 7 heads. We have a human-like figure with very scary fingernails and toenails like talons. We have these wings, we have his pointy ears, and of course the tail. You can see how this might actually coincide nicely with some of Garcia Marquez's monsters that we'll get to. This we've seen. Another Mexican, this is largely Mexican Baroque. The Baroque is always physical. It doesn't shy away from physicality. What's going on here? The lactation of San Cayetano, he's called in Spanish, Saint Cajetan, I'm not sure how to say it in English, Juan Tinoco, and you'll see it's 17th century Mexico, our high Baroque, or our, let's say, middle Baroque period, because high Baroque really does come in 1740s, 1750s. This is 17th century, 1600. Mary is nursing the swooning saint, that is giving him her breast. And if you see close up, his eyes are rolled back in his head. He has a vision of being nourished by the very body of Mary. We see plenty of virgins of milk, let's see, vírgenes de la leche, especially in the Peruvian tradition. We aren't surprised when Mary is nursing her own child. What is surprising to many people is the saints that receive milk, at a distance, granted, from the breast of Mary. Another one is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the very important saint in France, but it's a very special honor, either to receive the stigmata, as Saint Francis does and other saints do, that is, receive the same treatment as Christ by having their hands pierced miraculously, or to receive the same treatment, which is to be nursed by the Virgin. So here we have this very physical, almost oddly physical moment to suggest the importance of the presence of the non-physical in the world of the viewer. Notice, we could go into this further. No, I don't notice. We're going to go on. Here, St. Francis Xavier with a flame coming out of his chest. Again, this body as active vehicle and vessel for spirit. Why a flame? Look at his eyes are rolled back. Why a flame? Because he was a great preacher. St. Francis Xavier is the lieutenant of St. Ignatius, another Baroque saint. He's told to go to the east to preach. He was a great preacher. His 4 journeys to China and thereabouts are well documented. There are maps that trace his voyages. He dies in the east. Another by Cabrera. What's going on here? This is a huge panel in Tepoztlan. It's called, in fact, St. Francis Xavier Tepoztlan, now the Vice-Regal, Museo del Virreinato, the Museum of the Vice-Royalty, or the colonial period in Mexico. It's a church, a Jesuit church outside of Mexico City, well, now almost inside Mexico City, engulfed by the city, though still its own separate little town, Tepoztlan. This is a huge canvas for the interior of a church, and what do we have? We have Christ, blood coming out of all of his wounds, going down to the souls in purgatory who are nurtured by his blood. The blood becomes a great theme. It runs here and there. You'll remember a scene in 100 Years of Solitude, if you've read it before, about blood finding its way from here to there. But in any case, why such an emphasis on Christ's blood? Why not on the beautiful Assumption? Why? Because the Protestants, again, those Protestants, they're challenging the very theory of the Mass, which is transubstantiation. They're challenging the very idea that during the Mass, that bread is the body of Christ and the wine is the blood. Catholics believe in the transubstantiation, the miraculous conversion of those elements to the body and blood of Christ. What happens with the Protestants? They say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to say it's symbolic. So it's bread and it's grape juice in some traditions. It may be wine in others. But it's not Christ's blood. It's symbolic of the blood. So you can go to the Methodist Church for months without having an actual communion service where there's bread and grape juice. Whereas for the Catholics, Christ's blood is the Mass. It is the Eucharist. So one more of the sacraments, the Eucharist, that is thrown out the window by the Protestants and becomes a great theme in Catholic painting. So there you have it, the importance of Christ's blood for the salvation of souls. Some aren't going to be saved, by the way. You see a few dark figures here who just aren't looking up and are not being benefited by Christ's blood, you see. It's a whole morality tale there. Now my Magdalene paintings, as I said, she's the poster girl of the Baroque saints, in part because it was okay to paint her partially nude. There were constrictions against nudity in religious painting, but here often she'll have her breasts exposed. This is that moment of conversion. She's pushing away her life of luxury with her left hand, pulling off her pearls with her right. By the way, one of her attributes, I've said it but not explicitly, is her hair. She's always shown with long auburn or red hair flowing down. Part of that kind of sensuality of this penitent. We'll see that. And again, look at the floor. We see those broken pearls, those tears, and that symbol of her conversion, and that symbol of her moving from grit to pearl, from sullied to saintly. And the Baroque pearls, again, in that brooch. We've seen this one. We're going to go by that. One more, Magdalene. In fact, there are two more, I believe. Here she is after Christ's death. She's looking at a crucifix, so we know that it's after Christ's death. She's out in the wilderness. She spends, according to legend, the rest of her life in the south of France. There are places, Autun, A-U-T-U-N, if you know that, where it is considered by tradition and by deep-seated belief that she went and she spent the rest of her life in penance. Angels would bring her food. There are paintings of angels bringing Mary Magdalene food. But what I want to point out here is the Baroque quality of the art beyond the theology. She is envisioning Christ's death on the cross. Why is she staring at the crucifix? It's not just happenstance. It's because the theory is that if you look at the suffering Christ, you yourself will be aided in gaining salvation. So it's painting as propaganda, as program, as doctrine, as dogma. Mary Magdalene is often shown contemplating the crucifix. So this is very important. I also would talk, if I had more time, about the folds in her garment. That's a fabulous painting. To manipulate space, who would think that that's a flat old piece of canvas? The painter is showing off here. It's an Italian, by the way. I should have said that. I have some Italian Magdalenes. I'm going to show you a French one next. And then you get the fact that she's in a cave. So she's in her post-friend of Christ, or if you believe the Da Vinci Code, consort of Christ moment here, and often shown that way. Look at the hands, that flesh and blood realism to show sanctity. It's such a nice, transcendental naturalism. Keep that phrase in mind. And one more, Philippe de Champaigne. The French painters especially loved Mary Magdalene because she was theirs. She had gone to France, according to legend, and you'll find that legend in a 13th century manuscript just published by Princeton University Press called The Golden Legend. It's in 2 volumes, and our own Mrs. de Menil, who gave Houston so much, has given us The Golden Legend in translation, written by a monk named Bordachine in the 13th century, saying what people believed about the saints. Practically this much out of 2 volumes is biblical. It's in the Bible. The rest is just popular legends that grow up around these saints. This business of Mary Magdalene going to France and spending the rest of her life in penance in a cave is not in the Bible. It's in the Golden Legend, if you're interested in saints' lives. They're all great narratives, and they're all about excess and extreme. A saint is excessive. By definition, a saint is hyper holy, and oftentimes starts out by being hyper bad. St. Augustine is another one, a terrible sinner till he converts and becomes St. Augustine. So here we have, again, the hair. I'm going to show you. We have the vessel. Here we know it's the Magdalene. And she often is shown with a book and study. A skull, the skull will always mean thinking about how short life is, how fleeting the worldly goods are. And so for Mary Magdalene, it's perfect that she has a skull, because she herself used to think pearls were important, and now she knows better. She knows not to lay up her treasures on earth. And the hand, I guess I didn't put in my detail of the hands. I wanted to show you again the set of hands. This is Mexican, another important Mexican artist. It's a bit late, it's on toward neoclassicism. This is before and after. Here's the Magdalene in her very fancy room. There's a mirror here with a little picture of a suitor on it. You can't see it, a kind of gallant young man. And she's got her pearls, but you see she's weeping. She's already understood that this is not for her. And then over here we see her back in a cave with a kind of very orderly garden in front of her. This is the wilderness back here, but the painter is trying to tell us so much. I can't even read exactly this. It's called Hortus Conclusus, enclosed garden, but there's some reference there to the Garden of Eden, I suspect. This back here looks more like the wilderness scenes that we're used to. And then another Magdalene who is Mexican, Baltasar de Chave y Villa, 17th century, looking more haggard. She's swooning. Whenever you see those eyes, she's in communication with God. That's what swooning. Swooning, we use it to mean things that really, she's in ecstasy, is what I should say. What's the etymology of that word, ecstasy? Ecstasis, standing outside yourself. She's standing outside of herself. She again has the crucifix. She's contemplating her slain Christ. Again, the folds, but not so ostentatious. Not such a good painter as the Guido Reni that we saw a minute ago. Okay, and then a few more. Just because I got interested in the Magdalene, this is again France. Remember the scene after Christ, when Mary Magdalene is the first to go to the tomb of Christ and find that it's empty? She's the first one to recognize. I mean, she's quite an important figure in Christ's life, and that's where Dan Brown is very, very smart. And there are several good new books on the Magdalene if anybody's interested in her history as a cultural artifact. That's how I would put it. I mean, I'm interested in the role she plays in the Bible, but then how she becomes so much more in terms of legend, and her legend continues with the Da Vinci Code and with other current treatments of her as a consort of Christ, which is, of course, very heretical from any Catholic point of view. Here, she is doing what is done in that scene when she finds the tomb open. She goes to a figure she thinks is a gardener, and she says, "Have you seen my Lord?" And then she realizes it's Christ, and Christ utters the word, "Don't touch me." No, there it is at the top. Noli me tangere. It's Latin. I don't speak Latin, but there it is. It's often known, this scene, as Noli me tangere, don't touch me. I have not yet gone to my Father in heaven, he says. So he's not yet. So you get these rather poignant scenes of the great friend of Christ reaching out, and he's saying, no, no, unlike doubting Thomas, whom he lets touch the wounds. A little gender discrimination here. I put that next just to show it. This is another great Mexican Baroque artist. Look how good. This is academic art. These guys are schooled. There's nothing popular in the sense of popular. There's nothing anonymous about these painters. There's plenty of anonymous Baroque painting, but the ones whose names we remember are commissioned by churches, commissioned by religious orders, and they're very schooled. They begin by coming from Europe. Right away, Charles V, the first Habsburg king, sends artists, and certainly more under Philip II, the second Habsburg. They want their churches decorated. They know how important this is to the project of conversion of great masses of people who don't read Latin, don't read anything. And certainly for the priests and the friars, the early converting orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, the Mercedarians, the Fathers of Mercy or Brothers of Mercy, pictures were essential. So here we have a very beautiful example, I think. You can tell it's Baroque now. You know enough to see that. Look at the way the light is handled. That's chiaro oscuro. Look at the way that we have a kind of active cast of characters, but in the dark. Look at the way that Christ's body is handled. This could only be Baroque. Well, it could be high Renaissance. It could be late Michelangelo. But if you think of the David statue, it's very anatomically correct, but it's all external. There's nothing here. You sense the internal, the emotional, the fragile quality of the moment, and of course the robes, of course the handling of the folds. That's the end of this particular series, and now I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time, I'm afraid. I'm going to skip. I was going to show you the next series. I was going to show you some of the trompe-l'oeil art, the way that the Baroque loves to play with perspective, loves to fool your eye or deceive your eye. We might do some of that the next time I talk to you, but let's look now at what I call folk Baroque. That's going to be the less doctrinal, the less correct. It's going to be the more Latin American, because indigenous hands in rural churches are allowed, indeed encouraged by friars and then by priests, to exercise their creativity. Now, I've already said that creativity didn't get invented until the originality, and that's true. But the friars and then the priests and the secular clergy would have seen the irregularities in some of these churches, would have seen that this doesn't look quite like Catholic art. Oh my goodness, I think I may have run out of time. How can that be? I might have to show this to you next time, or quickly. How much time? Oh, I only have, oh my goodness. Well, I'm sorry I didn't go more quickly. Let me just show you really one facade in Bolivia. This is San Lorenzo Potosi. It has amazing figures here and here that you won't see in any place in Europe, and I'm going to show them to you. They're indigenous figures holding up columns. Look at these. Art historians who are learning about the counter-conquest of the New World Baroque pay particular attention to these figures. There's one, and then, oop, we skipped one, and then another. So there you see the kind of excessive or extraordinary quality of the New World Baroque in architecture. And I'm out of time. Thank you very much for listening, and maybe go to this website and take a look. Thanks.